Hi, I am Erinvor, and welcome to a new summary about the Lord of the Rings. This is the part 1 of the second chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring. Bilbo already left the Shire, leaving anything to Frodo that had to deal with the townspeople who came to beg and to claim their gifts. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell of the notifications if you don't want to lose the next videos. And if you like this kind of content and want to contribute with a free donation, there is a direct PayPal link in the description. Thank you in advance and enjoy! The second disappearance of Bilbo was discussed in the Shire for a whole year. Many extravagant theories were expressed publicly about the mystery of what happened during the party of the Bilbo's birthday. Stories were told about him that were so outlandish that people came to believe that he was a legendary figure ready to suddenly reappear with sacks full of gold and jewels, greatly stimulating the imagination of the youngest. The current opinion was that Bilbo had a screw loose and probably fell into some river or pond, ending his days. Of course, most people blamed Gandalf. In time, the hobbits of Hobbiton began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation. He looked just like a young hobbit, even though he was almost 50 years old. The similarities with Bilbo were becoming more and more apparent. He could often be seen wandering alone through the woods, having long conversation with the strange travelers who might be passing through the Shire in those days. He was looking for news of the outside world as the wizard's absence lasted for several years. Many elves who had rarely been seen in the Shire in the past were now crossing the woods and heading west, leaving Middle-earth and disregarding its problems forever. There was also an unusual number of dwarves on the ancient east-west road leading to the dark refuges at the far end of the Shire. They were restless and whispered words like the enemy and the land of Mordor. It was said that the Dark Tower had been rebuilt and its forces had begun to spread out in every direction. It was said that orcs were multiplying and were armed with fearsome weapons, and even worse, new abominations had been sighted. Meanwhile, wars broke out in the Far East and South, and the panic grew. Even in the Shire, some people began to discuss the mysterious things that were being heard from the outside world. Sam Gamgee was very interested to know what was happening in the Middle-earth, while Ted Sandyman insisted that he did not want to worry about it. Many times, the two of them found themselves at Bywater's Green Dragon Inn discussing dragons, strange beings, and phantoms tree men. Sam seemed to give credence to tales from the North Farding, where Cousin Al himself had reportedly spotted a human-like tree, an elm to be precise, wandering across the moors. These accounts were obviously met with skepticism. Sam also told of a glimpse of an elf in the woods and hoped to see more of them in the future. When he was a boy, Bilbo had told him about the elves' art of navigation and the dark shelters in the west. It was true, however, that many strangers passed through the Shire, and the borderers were busy in those days. Initially, Gandalf had been away for 3 years since the day of the party of Bilbo. Over the next 2 years, he turned up quite often, sneaking in after dark and leaving before dawn. He was always very reserved and never revealed anything about his travels. His interest was in Frodo's health and activities. Another 9 years had passed since his last visit, and Frodo had begun to believe that he would never return. Finally, one night, the wizard reappeared at his door. He was older and worn, his face marked by worry and wisdom, but his eyes still shone with the same light. The hobbit, on the other hand, had not aged at all. Gandalf waited until the next morning to discuss about the ring, arguing that such matters should be broached in the light of the day. So the two sat down together. At first, he did not fully understand the nature of the ring, but later he discovered that it was far more powerful and dangerous than he had dared to imagine at first. He understood that he wielded a dark power over any mortal who possessed it, until it was the ring itself that would take possession of the bearer. He said that in the ancient times, in a region south of Rivendell, many magic rings were made, some very powerful, others less. These great rings of power were extremely dangerous. Whoever possessed one of them could not die or grow old. Every use of the ring to make oneself invisible led to the individual fading out inexorably until every single minute became exhaustion, and sooner or later making himself permanently invisible, and finally being taken by its dark power. Bilbo was certainly not aware of this. He would never have handed over anything that would have put him in danger. He realized that he had become an enormous burden for him and made him worry and uneasy, but he blamed himself. The ring would sometimes shrink and expand, so he decided to tie it to a chain. Gandalf had been suspicious of the nature of the ring since the time of the White Council, when the dark power was driven from Mirkwood. At first he found it curious that Bilbo had lied about how he came into possession of the ring. The purpose was to avert any claim on the ring, as Gollum himself had done, calling it his birthday present. Bilbo's family was long-lived, and this had calmed Gandalf's concerns down. But on the night he left the Shire, the wizard was hopelessly disturbed by Bilbo's words, and from that day on, he devoted himself to the search for the truth. The fact that Bilbo had willingly given up the ring was a good sign. It showed that the hobbit had a much stronger character than even the wise man could suspect. Indeed, no one was as knowledgeable about the hobbit's culture and temperaments as Gandalf, not even themselves. There was no need to worry about Bilbo. The shadow over him would disappear, and he would be the same hobbit he was before the whole thing. The wizard asked to examine the ring, and Frodo removed it from the chain and handed it to him. He noticed how the ring had become heavier, as if he did not want to be touched by Gandalf. before throwing it into the glowing embers of the fireplace. Frodo lunged for the pliers and retrieved the ring, but Gandalf blocked him and gave him an inquisitive look from under his bushy eyebrows. He closed all the shutters and curtains, and the room grew dark and silent. The muffled sound of Sam Gamgee's gathering scissors could be heard from outside. The old man reached for the springs and pulled the ring out of the burning embers and placed it on the floor for a moment. Then picked it up. The ring was perfectly cold, and he handed it to Frodo. Suddenly, an inscription appeared where before there was nothing but smooth gold. In Elvish letter there was an engraved phrase in the language of Mordor. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. These were just two of the lines of an ancient Elvish poem. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarfs' lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. In the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. The one in Frodo's possession was none other than the Sovereign Ring. Gandalf told of Sauron and his return to the Dark Tower. His plans were not yet ripe, but he was fast becoming very strong. The enemy needed the ring, the one, in order to demolish all resistance, destroy the last defenses, and plunge all the lands into another darkness. 3 of the 7 rings given to the dwarf kings had been recovered, while the others had been destroyed by the dragons. The 3 rings of the elves' kings had been hidden. The 9 given to the kings of men brought them under his rule, corrupting their hearts until they were utterly ensnared and become wraiths, shadows under his great shadow. The story of the ring is very long and complicated, so Gandalf only told the final part. Once Gil-galad, the Elvish king, and Elendil of Númenor fought Sauron together and paid for their heroic deed with their lives. So it was that Isildur, son of Elendil, seized the ring by cutting off Sauron's finger. The spirit of the Dark Lord was overcome and fled, remaining hidden for many years in the form of a shadow in the Mirkwood. However, the ring was lost in the Anduin River, where Isildur was ambushed by orcs, and all trace of the ring was lost. Long afterwards, the area was inhabited by a few hobbit peoples related to the race of Sturs, skilled and experienced fishermen. Among them were Sméagol and Déagol, 2 inseparable friends. One day they went near the Anduin River. Déagol stayed behind to fish while Sméagol wandered along the banks. Suddenly Déagol was thrown into the water by a large fish that had taken a bite from his rod, dragging him down. He saw something glistening on the bottom and grabbed it. he had almost choked to death when he finally returned to the surface. In his hand was a beautiful shiny gold ring that filled his heart with joy. But Smeagol, who had been watching him secretly, came forward and asked for the ring as a present for his birthday. The eagle refused. A violent scuffle ensued between the two. The eagle put the ring on his finger and disappeared, while Smeagol was strangling him to death. No one ever knew what had happened to the eagle. Smeagol found out about the ring's power of invisibility and used it for sinister purposes, such as spying on people and wickedly exploding the news he learned. Everyone began to hate him and kick him, even relatives and friends. So he started stealing and got into the habit of mumbling to himself, so much so that people gave him the nickname Gollum. He was banished and for a while wandered alone, shedding a few tears at the wickedness of the world. Even the light of the sun and the warmth of his rays had become uncomfortable to him. So it was that he sought the darkness and coolness within the misty mountains. He crawled as slimy and slow as a worm into a deep cave, disappearing from the face of the earth, together with a ring of which he was never heard from again.